Hey people, just Siobhan here, quickly jumping in at the start of the show to remind you that we have a new sponsor, and that is the Animal Publics book series, which is part of the University of Sydney Press. So the wise people at the University of Sydney have decided to have an animal studies focused series. It's called Animal Publics. It has fantastic series editors in Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Melissa Boyd. It is the hot place to publish your animal studies work, and also a good place to go and look if you want to stock up on animal studies publications for your institution. So check out Animal Publics, part of the University of Sydney Press. This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I just attended the ASA 2019 AGM. It was fantastic. ASA is doing so much invaluable work to support animal studies scholars. It needs members. Membership is only $15 a year for unwaged and $60 a year for the waged. That's Australian dollars. And people can pay from all around the world. So they have PayPal transfers. It's very easy. Please have a think about joining ASA. ASA has a new president, Melissa Boyd. She's absolutely fantastic. Philip Armstrong, the previous president, is absolutely fantastic as well. But the organisation is just going from strengths to strengths. So please think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from the 2019 ASA conference, Decolonising Animals, that's taking place in Christchurch, New Zealand. And once again, I'm really lucky to be joined by someone who I would perhaps not normally have the opportunity to interview. So this week I'm joined by André Krebber. André is Assistant Professor in Social and Cultural History and Human Animal Studies at the University of Kassel in Germany. And today we're going to discuss his co-edited book, Animal Biography, Reframing Animal Lives, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. And I've got to give a shout out to André's co-editor, Mika Rocha. Oh, not too bad, I'm getting the nod. Welcome to the podcast, André.
Hi, Siobhan. Thank you so much for having me on.
My absolute pleasure. So why this book? What inspired it?
Well, I guess in the first place, it really came about from pragmatic reasons. I had just started the new job and we're just chatting with Mika and we were trying to find a project that would work for the both of us. But animal biographies came up really quickly. So Mika comes from a very strong historical background, a lot of empirical research. I come a little bit more from a much more interdisciplinary perspective, I guess, but also with a strong literary perspective. And biography seemed as the one thing that really brought these things quickly together. But also, I guess, we're both interested in thinking about the individualities of animals and trying to bring those into larger discourses in the academy, but also beyond. And again, biography is a genre that really connects both the different worlds, like the popular world and the academic world, but it also really sets at the center stage, at least from the first perspective, the individual. And I guess these different strands came together in our decision to pursue animal biography as an issue.
Wonderful. So why do you think it is that academics struggle to tell the stories of individual animals? What's challenging about that?
That is a very good question. I mean, to some degree, so that's something interesting about biography, I guess, as well, which I realized actually working on the project more than I knew that beforehand. Biography is an incredibly ubiquitous genre. But in the academy, it is big in literary studies, obviously, although not necessarily having a high profile. It is huge in historical research, for, I guess, to some degree for the wrong reasons, because it has this history of writing stories about famous white old men throughout history to sort of tell how great often Western civilization really is. So in some respect, it is actually very central in academia, but it is not very much seen that way. And that's the other side of it, which I came to realize through the project, really, is there's this fairly small, I guess, or in a pocket kind of happening, a discussion, a very theoretical and deep discussion around biography and how biographies work. And through these, it becomes really clear what a challenging genre biography really is. It is easy enough to sort of create this idea of a continuous individual, or the story of an individual, especially in the context of history and talking about these great men, when you want to retell sort of how great some political achievements or whatever are. But if you really start thinking about biographies, and one of the central reference points, I guess, in the 20th century for that is no, I can't remember his name. But thinking about biographies as a fractured issue, and that it's not that easy to just create a biography, because biographies can be very fractured. So I think that kind of explains a little bit more why it is so difficult to write biographies, and especially good biographies.
So why is it important then to talk about animal biographies? Why does this concept or this practice change the conversation around animals in an important way?
Yeah, so in the beginning, when we started the project, it was I had a very naive approach, I think, to biography, and I did really just think, well, that way you can talk about animals in an individual way, and that way you can bring the individual to people and make them recognize animals as individuals. And going through the project, I had to question this perspective myself by starting to read more about biographies, think more about biographies. And following from that, I think the scholarly, one of the main things it can really does is sort of by looking at animal biographies and seeing, and maybe finding it a little bit easier to consider the biographies of animals as fractured, as more complicated, or not as direct. It also reflects back on us and helps us to rethink our own biographies and our own engagement, I guess, with ourselves, with other individuals, with other groups of individuals and their experiences. And that's, I guess, something that I always or like to include in my work, or that strains I like to follow in my work. It's where does it, not the straightforward translating from us to them, but really reflecting what means the confrontation with other than human animals help us retell our own stories, and thereby reconnect our perspectives on the world with animals, and thereby unsettle, I guess, our own humanness in that respect.
Because one of the things you observe in the introduction is that, of course, there's great uncertainty around what we can know and how well we know and how correctly or how fairly we know animals. So really it's about us. It's not about them, it's about what we think about them in some way. Can you say something about that?
Yes. I think that's, again, another central strain that runs through my work in general, and where I found animal biographies to be especially helpful in breaking up or thinking about how we can break up the perspectives we have on animals. Because I mean, I'm as excited as most other animal studies scholars about talking about animals and looking at animals and exploring animals and the diversity of animals and of animal life, and the crazy stuff they do, the crazy stuff they can do, the crazy forms, the beauty of animals, but also having relationships with animals, and exploring these different ways of experiencing the world. But I think where I come more from, or what is more important to me, is to change or look for ways of how to re-engage animals and to break through the patterns we have established around dealing with animals.
Wonderful. So agency is a theme that is important to you in the book and that you write about in the introduction. How does the concept of animal agencies feed into the idea of animal biographies?
That's a tricky one, because it is, again, connects to the difficulty of biography and the question of are we actually creating our own biographies and how are we creating them? So I guess in the context of the book in particular, again, it is more about breaking through the patterns we have ourselves, and when we look at animals and think about animals, and looking for ways to engage people differently with animals, rather than to focus on the agency of animals. So that's in the context of the book, but more generally, and I think that we can probably relate that back to the question of biographies as well, and actually look at the limitations of agency, also of our own agency, I guess, in a wider social context. Sort of what are the opportunities we actually have to make a difference in the lives we live and in the constraints we live and the social constraints we live. And that is something that you can really bring out within animals and through biographies as well. I guess especially if you look at not individual biographies, because biography as a genre can be bigger as well, and look at group biographies as well. And if you connect that to some of the where animals are especially used, I guess, in agriculture, in bigger contexts, in bigger groups, sort of to look at the restraints of agency, not just necessarily through ways where animals sort of revolt against that, those restraints, but also to look at where are the limits of their agency, where can't they act out their agency, and then identify sort of these constraints and make them visible as something where we can work against, maybe in a more activist context, I guess, but also scholarly. Because
so you've got these wonderful authors all contributing these chapters. Can you tell us perhaps one or two of your favourite chapters, or some of the things that you can find in the book that were interesting or stand out to you?
We were actually incredibly lucky with the responses we had for the conference call. So the book comes from a conference we had initially, and we were very lucky with having a lot of very high quality responses to it, and that carries over in the book. So it's really difficult to actually decide between all the papers we receive, but I do have some favorites, and highlighting especially the piece by Friederike Middelhoff, Recovering and Reconstructing Animal Selves in Literary Autozoographies, is one of my favorites, on the one hand because I've known Friederike for a while now, and we have had sort of a similar journey, I guess. I knew her, or I know her through a summer school where we went to together twice, and then had the opportunity to work with her and just engage over her ideas and her readings of literature afterwards. And the piece she has contributed to this book just is so detailed and so empathetic in her reading of those autozoographies, and especially the genre of autozoography in a wider, I guess, scholarly context, also in literary scholarship, just draws initially sort of more mocking responses. But she does such a great job, and she has such a fine understanding and reading of these autozoographies that she really responds excellently to some of those very superficial, they're very unrecognizing responses to the biography in general, but especially to the idea of an autozoography or an autobiography of animals. And I think that someone like
That's okay. And is there any other chapters that you want to draw our attention to?
Right. And the second piece I really enjoyed was by Radhika Subramaniam from New York, The Elephant's Eye, Looking for Abul Abbas. And what makes that a really standout piece for me is that Radhika really tries to employ different ways of storytelling and blends those with cultural history and explorations in the cultural history of elephants, and that particular elephant, Abul Abbas, and that she just tries to engage the stories of animals and of this particular animal in this context in a very rich way that does not, however, just focus on the scholarly side, but also brings in empathetic approaches. She carries in and brings in travel writing, bringing in her own travels. Abul Abbas was an animal that was brought to Europe from Asia, and connects this with her own travels and her own journey in exploring the story of Abul Abbas, and bringing these different perspectives together. So very interdisciplinary, but also very empathetic kind of scholarship. I think that's the way to go for us as animal studies scholars, but also for scholarship in general, to rethink some of these more dry analytic approaches, I guess. So,
given everything you learnt about animal biographies on your journey of this conference and this book, this collected works, what would your message be to animal studies scholars? How would you like animal studies scholars to approach telling animal stories differently as a result of all the things you've reflected on?
That is a very difficult question. For myself, I would really like to explore the genre more as a creative writer. But for myself, I haven't really I haven't found a way in for myself. But that has more something to do with where I'm coming from, I guess, and that I approach things usually in a much more analytical, philosophical way. So I think picking up on especially what I just said about Radhika's contribution is really to look for new ways and try to rethink scholarship actually in a different way. And the theoretical discourse around biography can help with that. But in the end, it is really a question of bringing together these different strains of scholarship you can follow, but then weave out of these different perspectives really a story, not necessarily a coherent story. I think I would like, or I would prefer to focus on the fractures, because I think those open up opportunities also to empathize with animals in a different way. But also in these fractures, I think we can grow different perspectives and different approaches to animals. So I think really exploring the more creative side of scholarship and leading scholarship into this creative or more open, empathetic ways of writing and representing animals. I think that's where biography provides us with an opportunity to pursue exactly these approaches.
Wonderful. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I will try my best to keep short with them.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
That was the most difficult, or the second most difficult one, I guess, of those questions. I can't really. I have a very long history of animal advocacy and animal rights advocacy, and I can't really recall the point where I started reading stuff. I mean, there were pamphlets. There were a couple of more obscure books in the 90s, I guess, that were coming out, often related or coming from sort of more of a punk context. But I can recall the first piece that had the most profound impact on me, I guess, and that was reading Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno on their representations of animals, especially in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. There are a few sections in the later part that very strongly spoke to me in terms of their empathy actually towards animals and how that came through in the writing.
Wonderful. If you had to recall the first piece of can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That I can actually. That was also in the context of my work with an animal rights group while I was still studying, which was actually a critique of animal advocacy at that time, because I could very well empathize with people and the frustration about how animals were treated and what we were trying to achieve. But I was a little bit frustrated at the same time with not enough reflection going on about how we do and how we approach animal advocacy and how much that can actually achieve and how much it takes into account the wider social context in which animal advocacy happens. So that was a critique of what I thought was problematic in that respect.
Fantastic. Sounds very interesting. Well, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
That was very easy, actually, and it has to be hands down Philip Armstrong. Primarily because I just had the opportunity to work with him here during my PhD for 5 years, but also during that time he has been so incredibly nurturing and supportive in really helping me to find my own way, both in my scholarship, but also in thinking through the scholarship in relationship to really wanting to change something for animals. And by just being a really, really good conversational partner for my research, but also around animals in general. And I guess to pick up on the animal biography theme again, it's really his empathetic approach, his own empathetic approach to animals in the first place, but then also in thinking through scholarship and what the role of scholarship can be.
Yes, the wonderful Philip, who's just stepped down as the president of ASA and also who chaired the Decolonising Animals conference that we're here attending. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I would say in the first place it's really to think through and understand better the underlying mechanisms that drive the exploitation about animals and just the way the relationships to animals are reproduced through cultural products, to cultural discourses throughout history. What is the history of this? So dive in a little deeper into these issues, which I very well understand that if you're centrally involved in animal advocacy, you don't necessarily have the time for that. Or the interest, which is perfectly fine. But I think that's something that academics really can bring to the table, and also sometimes maybe shows certain things that sometimes things are a little bit more complicated than it sometimes appears in advocacy. So there's a little bit of a tension there as well. But I don't find that necessarily problematic. I think that can help both sides of us, really. And in the end, I do see my scholarship as an advocacy as well. And I also recognize the very, very important work. And that was great here at the ASA, actually, during the conference on Wednesday night when we had that panel discussion with Chris, who's an animal advocate here in New Zealand. And I thought that was a very good example of how things can come together in that respect.
Absolutely. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
On the danger that it is a very anthropocentric and also a little bit corny thing to say, I would really like to know what my cat thinks about myself. So I think this element of communication, and I don't mind if she starts speaking human or I start understanding purring.
What do you think she thinks about you?
I have no idea. I know that she gets really upset with myself, with me, if I disrupt her patterns, which are very regulated and involve a lot of time spending on the sofa at night. So it's basically at between 6 and 7, she doesn't leave my side. And I wonder what she thinks about if I don't comply to that rhythm.
Right, yes. I like to think that Gracie the cat likes me, but perhaps I'm just an egomaniac having those thoughts. Yeah, well, if you find a way to talk to your cat, let me know, and I'll send Gracie across to share some thoughts about me with you. So what are you working on next?
At the moment, I'm working on 2 projects which are related. One is on octopuses with my colleagues Yvette Watt and Maike Riedinger, Anne Hölk and Toby Juleff, who are from Berlin, the University of Tasmania in Hobart, and Kassel. And at the moment we're working towards an exhibition on octopuses that explores artistic, scientific collaborations to see, on the one hand, what we can find out about octopuses and how we can see octopuses maybe, or move ourselves a little bit closer to octopuses in understanding them, but also to stage sort of an encounter with the alienness of the octopus, or as a very alien creature to us, to see how that can maybe disrupt some of the ways of how we're making sense of animals more generally. And the other project looks at aesthetics and aesthetic choices in animals. I've gotten really interested in aesthetics as a way into agency and the agency of animals as a way to both make that visible but also think around agency as an aesthetic, or aesthetics as an agency, expression of agency in animals.
Wow. Well, where can people find out about all this work?
Yeah, I'm not overly present actually on all social medias, but I have a Twitter account, which is, I think, Negative Zoology at André Krebber, my name. The other is academia. I usually post my papers on academia as soon as I'm allowed to.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can find us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. We also have an Instagram feed. And finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.